Did you know that the right to an education hasn't always meant the right to learn, together? For the longest time, we kind of just assumed that simply putting a child in a school, literally any school, even a totally segregated one, meant we were fulfilling their fundamental human rights. But what actually happens when we look a little closer at the laws? When you really dig into it, the journey from merely having a right to an education to actually having the right to sit in the exact same classroom as your peers, well, it's a pretty fascinating story of shifting global paradigms.
So, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to trace the incredible, decades-long journey of international disability rights. By unpacking the exact frameworks that shaped our modern world, we'll get to see exactly how global authorities, slowly but surely, realize that true education absolutely cannot exist alongside segregation. Let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 key stages. 1. The right to learn. 2. Early disability frameworks. 3. The Salamanca shift. 4. Education for all. And finally, number 5, the modern inclusion mandate.
Okay, starting off with Section 1, the right to learn, the foundations of education for all. Now, before we look at the history, it's totally crucial to understand the tools the international community actually uses to get things done. We've got a really clear distinction here between hard law and soft law. Conventions, those are the heavyweights. When a country signs a convention, it produces a strict, binding legal effect, no getting out of it. Declarations and resolutions, on the flip side, are considered soft laws. They don't legally bind a nation, but they are incredibly powerful for raising awareness, influencing policy, and basically nudging the world in the right direction. Keep this distinction in the back of your mind as we go.
Our journey today spans several decades of progress. We're starting way back in the aftermath of World War II in 1948, jumping ahead to a critical convention in 1989, hitting a massive paradigm shift in 1994, and finally arriving at the definitive, binding mandate of the modern era in 2006. Starting at the very beginning, Article 26 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights boldly stated, "Everyone has the right to education." It was absolutely necessary, and it framed education as a fundamental right for the full development of the human personality. But notice what isn't there? It doesn't specify how or where that education takes place. Because the wording was so broad, marginalized groups, and especially individuals with disabilities, were often completely overlooked or just pushed right out of mainstream systems entirely.
So, 12 years later, the international community tried to tighten things up. The 1960 UNESCO Convention explicitly outlawed educational discrimination, saying you couldn't deprive access or limit groups to education of an inferior standard. Sounds great, right? Well, here was the catch. People with disabilities were still frequently forced into segregated, separate schools under the guise that their education was special rather than inferior. The real, true integration piece still completely missing.
Moving on to Section 2, Early Disability Frameworks, Soft Laws and First Steps.
Heading into the 1980s, the international community finally started to specifically address disability rights in education, relying heavily on those influential soft laws we talked about. The 1982 World Program of Action was a total landmark. But I want you to notice that second point, because this is huge. Before 1982, the education of disabled children was usually handled by ministries of health or social welfare. They were literally treating disability as a medical problem to be managed. This document boldly declared that disabled children belong in the general school system, and, crucially, that standard, mainstream educational authorities must take responsibility for them.
So momentum is definitely building. In 1989, we get the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now remember our hard law discussion? This was a binding convention. Article 23 affirmed the right of disabled children to a full and decent life. But actually, scratch that. It disastrously weakened its own protection with one single phrase, subject to available resources. This essentially handed governments a giant legal get-out-of-jail-free card. They could just shrug, claim they didn't have the budget to integrate students with disabilities, and totally let themselves off the hook.
To fix those early, glaring flaws, the UN released the Standard Rules in 1993, outlining specific, concrete steps states must take. Step 1, a clear policy. Step 2, a flexible curriculum. And Step 3, quality materials with ongoing teacher training. The Standard Rules firmly insisted that integration into mainstream schools shouldn't be seen as a cheap option. You couldn't just drop a child with a disability into a mainstream classroom with zero support and call it a day. It required real, serious structural investment.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Salamanca shift, changing the educational paradigm.
What happened in 1994 literally changed the educational paradigm forever.
And interestingly enough, it was driven not just by activists, but by the professionals working in the schools themselves. The Salamanca Statement introduced something vital: child-centered pedagogy. Before Salamanca, the whole vibe was trying to fix the child to fit into a rigid, existing school system. And if they didn't fit, sent away to a segregated special school. Salamanca completely flipped the script. It demanded that we fix the school system itself. It challenged inclusive schools to adapt the learning to the diverse needs of the child, rather than forcing the child into some preordained box of what a student should be.
Article 4 of the Salamanca Statement triggered this massive global shift with a very simple yet profound concept: human differences are normal. That's it. That idea moved the world away from segregated special education being the default toward the concept of the fully inclusive neighborhood school as the absolute standard for a respectful, people-oriented society.
That leads right into Section 4, Education for All, a global collective commitment.
You see, this child-centered thinking from Salamanca perfectly aligned with a much broader global push happening throughout the 90s and 2000s to eliminate educational disparities for everyone. This was really driven by two major milestones. First, the 1990 Jomtien Declaration, which forced the world to finally admit that severe educational disparities existed across a ton of vulnerable groups, pushing for far more flexible systems. Then, a decade later, the 2000 Dakar Framework became a massive collective commitment by 164 countries to achieve comprehensive primary education for everyone by 2015. They made inclusion a top priority for global development.
And the beautiful thing is, it wasn't just about disability. These global frameworks required sweeping actions across the board. For people with disabilities, it demanded integral access without segregation. For girls and women, the total elimination of gender stereotyping. And for the underserved and poor, the active removal of educational disparities. These documents proved once and for all that inclusive education isn't some niche issue. Building a flexible, welcoming educational system benefits society as a whole by lifting up every single vulnerable group simultaneously.
And now, our final section, number 5, the Modern Inclusion Mandate, Binding Law and Practical Measures.
So, all of these historical soft laws, the paradigm shifts of Salamanca, the global momentum of education for all, they all paved the way for the ultimate legal mandate. In 2006, the world got the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD. Under Article 24, all those great philosophies from the past finally transformed into binding, hard international law. It legally mandates an inclusive education system at all levels. And hey, remember that loophole from 1989 about available resources? The CRPD slams that door shut. It explicitly states that persons with disabilities cannot be excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability. Period.
What I absolutely love about the CRPD is how incredibly practical it is. There is no room for excuses here. It demands highly specific measures, facilitating Braille and alternative scripts, promoting sign language and the unique linguistic identity of the deaf community, employing specifically qualified teachers, and requiring rigorous disability awareness training for all educational staff. This isn't just about unlocking the school gates, it's about fundamentally overhauling what happens inside the building to ensure every student can actually learn.
The ultimate goal is crystal clear in Article 24. Effective individualized support measures are provided in environments that maximize academic and social development consistent with the goal of full inclusion. The really key phrase there is in environments. The support must come to the child inside the general classroom. It completely removes the concept of systemic segregation. The neighborhood school has to be equipped to support the child, full stop.
So, we've traced over 6 decades of international legal progress today. From a super vague right to education all the way to a strict, legally binding mandate for full integration and child-centered learning. These frameworks absolutely change the world on paper. But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a real question to chew on. How inclusive is the school in your neighborhood? Has your local community truly lived up to these decades of hard-fought progress?